that it was through him I did go to someone. She sounds very fond of that doctor and very loyal to him. Likewise, when she says, "But I think he's the best." And when she says, "And I think we both," referring to herself and that doctor, she makes the relationship sound to have been very mutual. There's a kind of we feeling here that very much needs responding to in the interviewer. When she describes the kind of relationship she had with her, quote, "baby doctor," unquote, their having blasted one another back and forth, it is very striking, the contrast to the interview with Dr. Semrad. I feel that she must be staving off feelings of disappointment in the immediate interview because it's so far removed from the kind of relationship she feels she developed with her baby doctor. A little later on, she clearly brushes aside his misguided attempt to be sympathetic to her in connection with her treatment at the hands of her baby doctor. It seems to me that she responds in a healthy way at this point, manifesting more of a realistic adult orientation than he had been perceiving her to have. It's as though she wants no part of his attempt to baby her. When she says, quote, "Actually, I really never had any feeling at all," unquote. And this is referring to some other part of her illness experience. And then says later on about the baby, quote, "She smiled in the hospital," unquote. "It is apparent to me that she felt competitive with her baby, who seemed to her so much better able to feel than did the patient herself." In describing her having gone to several doctors before she could become pregnant, she described this in such a way as to suggest an underlying unconscious fantasy on her part of having gotten pregnant by one of the doctors. This, like nearly every one of the things I'm commenting upon here, I would have commented upon to the patient herself. There seem to me a number of clues that this woman unconsciously equates the ideal mother and the doctor, any doctor, with God. For example, she says concerning her baby doctor, "I was leaving everything in his hands. He used to tell me exactly what to do." Then later, in the context of expressing her disappointment with the three doctors, "I just figured it was in God's hands." Later on, she says, "I had gone to this first psychiatrist and had more confidence than I ever felt before, which was due to medication." This I find strikingly disavowing of any significant relationship with the first psychiatrist, and I sense it may well be that she had gained from that first psychiatrist the conviction that any improvement was due to medication. That, in other words, her denial was a mutual denial of the meaningfulness of the relationship between them. This I find substantiated by her the tone of voice when she says, quote, "which was due to medication," unquote, namely a tone of reciting something which she has been trained to say and believe. It seems to me very likely that she and the first psychiatrist felt unconsciously guilty about the meaningfulness of their relationship, probably equating it unconsciously with incest, and unconsciously agreed to tell the world that they had essentially no relationship, and that any improvement in her was due solely, therefore, to the medication. Later on, it is very moving the way the patient is speaking, and I reminded myself at this juncture that I should not forget this in evaluating the worth of Dr. Semrad's interview. I shouldn't forget that the patient came to speak with this degree of feeling during the course of the interview. When she says, quote, "I fell flat on my face by becoming a shrew, and never really even then looking at the baby and enjoying her," unquote, I surmise that the question of whether Dr. Semrad is enjoying the interview is one which is important to this patient. A bit earlier, when she had made the reference to Dr. Rees's yawn, she had evoked from the audience, no doubt including Dr. Rees, a reaction of enjoyment, which she has not yet evoked from Dr. Semrad. This, where she is speaking so very movingly, let's see, and she says she became a shrew at home, and then all of a sudden I had the most empty feeling that I ever had in my life and started calling up the church and exclaiming, "Where's God? Where's God?" But I really did believe and do believe now that I lost the grace of God, and so on. Very moving stuff indeed. And it's greatly to Dr. Semrad's credit that this happened in the interview, that such a depth of feeling was reached. Now, a little later, she says of her present state, she says, "I could start thinking foolish again and say the devil is planting this idea in my mind, so I don't want to psychoanalyze it too much. I just as soon enjoy it and look forward to a future with faith and confidence." It seems to me highly significant that she uses a metaphor here suggestive of impregnation, quote, "planting this idea in my mind," unquote. To me, this suggests two things. One, she had the delusion that her baby was a child of the devil. Secondly, she would have Dr. Semrad feel that if he plants in her mind seeds of doubt as to how solidly based is her present feeling of health and confidence, then he is being satanic. It is memorable evidence of the value of this interview when she says, quote, "I think that I had buried feelings all my life. I never really felt things, but I think there were buried feelings, so that when an empty feeling came on me, I recognized it as a complete emptiness, that I had no feeling for anything, baby, family, or anything, an emptiness that I had never known," unquote. I also want to set down at this juncture and to mention here an impression that I've had many times in listening to this tape. I listened to the tape only one time, but I had the impression many times, namely, that this patient is manifesting an abundance of feelings of various kinds in contrast to her own history of having been unable to have feelings. That she is so relatively well able to express feelings is testimony both of how much value she's been deriving from her work with Dr. Reese and of how capably Dr. Semrad is conducting this interview. But it also suggests how harsh are her superego standards. That is, an ideal mother should somehow be far better able to be aware of and to convey feelings. I shall be about 7 more minutes. Now, let's see. She says, quote, "Now I not only feel that the way I did before was buried feelings, I almost feel like I have feelings even that I can experience. And it really makes me a little bit too excited about it. I can't sleep now, so I really don't want to put too much into this and really go overboard," unquote. Here again the reference to this. I missed it when I wrote these notes. Here I would have responded to what she said as a valuable opportunity to explore with her mixed feelings about her having become better able to feel. Dr. Semrad's response, by contrast, is, "In those 7 years, did you think of trying to have a baby with someone else?" She replies to his question by saying no, and when he presses her a bit, saying, "Did the thought ever come to your mind?" she says, "Never." Each time, here, in replying no and never, she sounds to be reciting something without any conviction, and I would have taken up that spurious-sounding feeling tone with her. This spuriousness on her part, this saying what she feels she's supposed to say, trying to feel what she believes she's supposed to feel, is closely related to her massive problem of unconscious denial of authentic emotions. When I listen to the material on the tape, which concerns her feelings of love for the young man she met when she was 18, I surmise that the patient is displacing into the past and onto that man her feelings of love for Dr. Semrad. She says, quote, "But it was an ideal thing," unquote, so reminiscent of her yearning to find and her struggle to become herself an ideal mother. Again, when she says, quote, "But it was too nice," unquote, referring to that relationship with the young man, I hear this as an unconscious reference to the feeling tone of the interview, and so different in quality from her more lively arguing relationship with her, quote, baby doctor, unquote. When she said, quote, he was just one you dream about, that sort of thing, unquote. Meaning, of course, that he was just one whom a person dreams about. But when she said he was just one you dream about, that sort of thing, I would have deliberately taken the you. I would have said he was just one I dream about, because I would have heard the you as unconsciously referring to me personally. For although I feel sure she didn't mean that consciously, that she was unconsciously attributing homosexual interests to the interviewer. This would give him a chance, an opportunity to at least scratch the surface of her own bisexual identity. When she says, still about that formerly young man, quote, he's probably fat and paunchy right now, unquote. I heard this as meaning unconsciously right here and now. And when she says, quote, I don't even know what he looks like now, unquote, I realized that she isn't sure, literally, whether Dr. Semrad is that very man whom she loved many years ago. I very much wondered here whether Dr. Semrad had a paunch. In any case, I would have taken this opportunity to explore what I, quote, look like now, unquote, to her, and would have ventured to raise the question whether she may be unsure deep down whether I am he. I'd like to make a quote here from Heinrich Racker's book, Transference and Countertransference. This, to me, highlights something that I've been trying by implication to highlight in the fragment of my presentation, which I'm giving here this morning. Namely, that the interviewer's own psychopathology is always present, always enormously useful, and very much needs to come into the acknowledged interaction between himself and the patient to the very best of both persons' abilities to let that happen. Racker said, quote, the first distortion of truth in the myth of the analytic situation is that analysis is an interaction between a sick person and a healthy one. The truth is that it is an interaction between two personalities, in both of which the ego is under pressure from the id, the superego, and the external world. Each personality has its internal and external dependencies, anxieties, and pathological defenses. Each is also a child with his internal parents, and each of these whole personalities, that of the analysand and that of the analyst, responds to every event of the analytic situation, unquote. One more brief point I want to make, or 2 points. One, when she is speaking of her feelings about her father, it is apparent that her own experience with being a mother, her having come to discover her own human limitations, and her having come to at least a partial acceptance of these, has served to give her much more empathy toward her so deeply flawed father than she had ever used to possess toward him in her growing up. It may well be that her illness has served to accomplish this more than anything in regard to her feelings about her mother. It is probable that her father, more than her biological mother, had been her mother psychologically. A couple of other thoughts. When loss got discussed later on in the interview, at a time when only a quarter of Dr. Semrad's and this patient's time together remained, the aspects of loss got explored. And again, if time permitted, I would try to show how I felt that was being relived right there in the interview. That, among other things, Dr. Semrad was, I believe, unconsciously endeavoring to get this woman to acknowledge that she would miss him, which she damn sure should. The other point I want to make is that just as she was caught up in striving to be an ideal mother, any psychiatrist working with a psychotic patient is very likely to get caught up in trying to be an ideal psychiatrist, an ideally loving and empathic and patient and kindly psychiatrist. And if time permitted, I would talk really endlessly about the great value and need to have great access to one's hate in working with these patients. I always remember the great interest my late analyst showed when he said to me one day, he very seldom talked to me as one person to another, but he let me know that he had just been reading an article that had just come out by Donald Winnicott called Hate in the Countertransference. And I
want to express personal reaction. When I realized that I was to moderate this panel and read the summary that Dr. Searles had sent, in which he epitomized what were clearly heretic comments to be uttered in the cathedral that Semrad built, it was too late for me to back out. And yet, though the specific comments will be taken up later in the discussion, perhaps debate, my personal reaction with surprise after hearing these remarks is that I had the same feeling tone in hearing this interview material discussed by Dr. Searles that I had many times when Dr. Semrad discussed these interviews, which transcends the obvious differences that will be discussed later. The next presentation will be by Dr. Alan Siegel, who is a clinical psychologist. He received all of his degrees, A.B., Master of Ed, and Doctor of Education at Boston University, has had training at the Boston Psychoanalytic Institute, and is currently a special candidate for full analytic training there. He is a licensed practitioner of psychology, has had an incredible list of teaching responsibilities, many of which go on to this day, and his presentation will be on Semrad and the affective context. Dr. Siegel.
Thank you. It's true that I never worked directly with Dr. Semrad. I think I first discovered Dr. Semrad at Boston State Hospital when I went there after my graduate training with some interest keen interest in understanding psychosis, not seeing too much of it, I thought, at the BU Student Health Service, although retrospectively probably more than I cared to acknowledge, and learn from the patients what I needed to learn and subsequently learned from Dr. Semrad's work and people who were close to Dr. Semrad, Dick Kahn, John Arsenian, David Limentani. Listening to Dr. Searles' comments, especially around countertransference, reminded me of my first occasion on the ward that I eventually became ward senior of at the May unit at Boston State Hospital, when I was introduced in a community meeting, about 25 to 30 patients, a few beleaguered nursing staff, some residents, and I was introduced, and a patient rushed over and kicked me sharply in the shin. And it was quite an introduction. Very carefully, another patient sitting next to me leaned over and said, "That's how he says hello." And he added further, you should be glad that he wasn't wearing his heavy shoes. So that aggression means many different things, and that what I learned at that moment, I think, was that, one needs to understand the feelings and the context in which the affects emerge, although it may be painful in a lot of different ways. But some general principles I thought I would outline before getting to the clinical material that we're looking at this morning. Semrad wrote that the person who is vulnerable to schizophrenia had definitive limitations in their capabilities to delay response, circulate painful experience, and dissipate tension within the body. The constant ambivalence within relationships is experienced by a fragmented self, serves to thwart the development of stable ego ideals and indeed object constancy. Interpersonal relationships are, I think, for schizophrenics primarily painful, and when there's a significant loss, an even more painful state occurs. Diminished self-esteem is even further undercut, and there is an increase in feelings of helplessness with a concurrent mistrust of the caring and respect of other people. Precipitants to a psychotic regression, as we've heard, include stresses, losses, crucial life events, and the pain of these, making for, as Semrad described it, a subjective holocaust. A word or two about empathy. I understand it is some capacity of the therapist to grasp the patient's view of his or her situation and to see the world through the patient's experiences and the patient's memories. This last notion, the patient's memories, is very important, I think, to me and certainly my analytic work, because if you can imagine as you hear a story from a patient of a scene that they're describing now, a scene in their life, and then you can shift that in some way to imagine that scene through the filters of memories and ideas that you've heard, the scenes are very, very much different. And to be able to perceive that and experience that and to feel that in the context of the patient's experiences and memories seems to me to be a most crucial dimension in empathic connections with our patients. Empathy involves some connection with the inner view of the patient, now and before. Affects, of course, shape experiences and color memories, and what emerges in one's experience in sitting with a patient is a working model of the patient through which the investigation that Dr. Semrad had talked about can proceed. To make an empathic connection with the patient's affective experiences and the sources of the patient's confusion and suffering permits the therapist to explore many sensitive areas, many areas that one would expect can't be explored directly. And as we hear in the tape as well, while demonstrating to the patient our capacity to bear these painful affects. The therapist brings the therapeutic alliance to the patient, a situation clearly demonstrated, I think, in the interview as Dr. Adler described yesterday in his observations of Dr. Semrad's emphasis early in the interview on the observing ego stance and the stress on the observing ego stance. This is a different direction than Dr. Searles understood it this morning, but my sense would be more in the direction of supporting an observing ego. The alliance, the therapeutic alliance, is built upon the therapist being able to comprehend and communicate what the patient is in pain about, using language and images that are familiar to the patient. Communication is facilitated without undue intrusion. The therapist defines himself as a neutral object, although not bland, not substanceless, who can tolerate the patient's painful feelings while approaching an understanding of the patient's internal disarray from a rather different point of view. We've heard stories that Semrad could interview a patient who, at the start of the interview, was quite disorganized, florid, and by the time the interview was well along or through, the patient was talking in a more sensible fashion. It's very difficult to explain these kinds of phenomena. The best guess that I can make around this, in my experience when I'm fortunate enough to facilitate this in an interview, is that I think that when we make an empathic connection with the patient, if we provide what the patient requires in the interview, if we comprehend what is painful to the patient and we comprehend what he is feeling, and we can find some way to let him know that these interventions are both sustaining and are restitutive and reorganizing in and of themselves. This affective context, the patient's inner world of feelings, when it is not comprehended by the therapist, leads to misunderstandings and consequent failures of the therapeutic alliance and failures of the treatment. Semrad's attention to the affective context, this tapestry of feelings, experiences, and memories, is evident in the tape that we've been talking about. He's aware of the affective context in which the patient operates at any specific moment in the interview and can speak to that while maintaining a clear respect for the patient and her suffering. We can look at the interview a little bit more closely. He brings her to increasing levels of awareness and involvement with her affect while maintaining an appreciation for her particular sensitivities. Using her experiences with her child's pediatrician, Semrad wonders, it's on page 25, did he know that you were calling him because you were concerned about your child? Soon after that, he inquires, taking it a step further, seeing how she could bear her feelings, did your pediatrician know that you loved your baby? And this permits the patient, I think, to rather spontaneously associate to her distress at never feeling anything in association to the child, so that she could disagree with Semrad, she could reveal what she really was concerned about, this absence of feeling, quite easily, without feeling humiliated, without feeling diminished, without feeling embarrassed. And this is in the sense what it's so necessary for her to do, to be able to talk about what isn't there as well as what is. Later, as Semrad acknowledges the patient's painful experiences struggling to get pregnant, he is able to understand her religious views and how they influence her view of this dilemma. This empathic connection permits her to put aside the religious concerns for the moment to reveal the basic affective condition which may have been a major precipitant in her postpartum decompensation. As she says, I had the most empty feeling that I ever had in my life. By attending to what she can bear and by pushing her to tolerate more, she can reveal her true heartache. As the interview continues, he explores other representations of her emptiness, integrating derivatives of conflicts with representations of her lost father. In these interchanges about an earlier love, he synthesizes her restraint and idealism with physical aspects of loving, and he inquires, all of you responded to this man. When she is unable to respond, he reframes the question to a less specific and somewhat more Victorian, it was a full feeling of love for him. This she can do a little bit more with, and later he says, and how far did the two of you go in the expression of love? This question, this very sort of elaborate, flowery question, you wouldn't ask it today of a 13-year-old, but these questions then, and with this woman, you would ask it of this woman if she was sitting with you today, can be answered since he has kept in contact with her affect without mobilizing the constrictive superego prohibitions and other conflicts inherent in her view of love and relationships. Her responses over the course of the interview suggest an increasing capacity to be involved with the losses in her life and her emptiness, I believe, as a result of Semrad's empathic connection with her. Later on pages 35 and 36, Semrad continues to explore her mourning on this journey to her father. By persisting and in his attention to her feelings, Semrad takes the patient from describing her first love as puppy love to her declaration, "Well, my heart broke for a year." This declaration clearly follows Semrad's attention to the more generalized notion that, as he said, women are apt to love hook, line, and sinker. He both recognizes the intensity of her love and her embarrassment about it. He is respectful and sensitive by saying that others love hook, line, and sinker too, and so then she can be responsible for her own intense love. Later on pages 40, 41, and 42, Semrad is closer to the patient's first love or earlier love. Again, he introduces a difficult new connection through a generalization, what I call in my work a benign musing. He says, "Do you know what the most frequent complaint of mothers is about little girls?" I would say it differently, but the same sort of neutral tone. She says no. He answers, "They steal their husbands." And she responds, as you see, with a non-committal "oh." Well, then closer to her, he says, "You didn't know that?" She says no. He takes it closer still. "Didn't you do that?" And she flees, associatively talking about her husband and her baby, and in essence confirms their connection to this early issue with her father. In this one association, almost by magic, Semrad draws our attention and her attention at some level to the way in which the birth of this child, relationship with the husband, the relationship with the father, all sort of come together as a way to understand her psychosis. Anyway, the patient then says, I feel that he has shown more love since the baby has been born than he had before. Speaking perhaps of the therapist, who knows. But anyway, doggedly, Semrad persists. "But didn't you steal some love from mother that your father had for her?" She retreats again with an "I don't know." Then I think a true empathic connection emerges. Semrad says, "Who did your father listen to?" She associates, out of the blue, "Oh gee, no daddy's little girl there." Again, Semrad asks about whether father listened, and she is unresponsive. And still again he said, "But would he listen to you?" And she said, "I was his favorite daughter." Now, why does this work? Why does she say this? How in the world does Semrad know to ask about who this father, this drinking father, this abusive father, who he would listen to? Why would we expect that he would even listen to anyone? And why would this listening somehow permit her finally to be able to talk about this special relationship that is so embarrassing, so conflicted, so powerful, so ambivalent, and clearly so painful? My best guess is that he recalled at some level her earlier statement, early on in the interview, on page 23, when she said, "I was always an avid believer in a good glass of warm milk and a talk with someone." So I would guess that he would know that somehow talking, listening, drinking, somehow these kinds of things were central emotional components for this woman, and in the montage and the connections that emerge inside, somehow it made sense emotionally that the way to be involved with father at some point was through talk, and the way to talk with her and to engage with her in her feelings about father were also to discuss who father listened to. The patient tells us that her father is still with her in a delusional way. She says, "I feel that he is in purgatory and he sees all of this." Semrad begins the process of her mourning by offering her a way to keep and yet begin to give up Father by saying, "Would he have been proud of your daughter?" In making this connection, she can acknowledge that some of this postpartum emptiness was really for him. These and other interchanges demonstrate the importance for the therapist to be empathically connected to the patient's affective life and other aspects of her inner world. The patient can offer access to these difficult, unavailable areas and become more available to the therapist. Semrad's interventions serve to establish him, I believe, as an empathic reality for the patient. He provides a way for the patient to understand and conceptualize the disarray she's experiencing. This serves as one basis by which internal events can be reorganized. The simplicity, the openness of his language, his kindness and sensitivity provide the patient a human contact that is benign and yet significant. Semrad was able to say the most complex and affect-laden things in a way that conveyed all of the emotional substance, yet he permits the patient room to develop her own response. She doesn't have to agree out of compliance to control the object or to please the object, or disagree because the interventions threaten to activate unbearable affect. For us, I think Semrad offers the promise that regardless of how complicated and unavailable our patients' communications seem to be, that they can be translated into commonly shared affective experiences, into more universal human terms.